name is April Pugh, and I am the Communications Director for the National Nonprofit Education Policy Organization, United States Parents Involved in Education. The title of my presentation today is Child Abuse in the Classroom, and I know it's a bit shocking of a title, but when I get done, I think you'll find that it justifies the presentation. So United States Parents Involved in Education is a national nonprofit education policy organization led by parents, mothers mostly, but we do have a handful of men in our organization. It started back when I was in middle school and my husband was in middle school, and my mother-in-law started to see the comprehensive sexuality education come into play. I was very disturbed by that, so she went up to the school, had some words with them, got nowhere, so she decided to get into politics, and that's where our organization began. It began as South Carolina PIE and then branched off into a national organization. Once we saw the need for that, we've got an impressive advisory board with people like Michelle Malkin, Alex Newman, Dr. Duke Pesta, Dr. Gary Thompson, and Professor Sandra Stotsky, as well as several others, but those are some of the more prominent ones. We have 20 state chapters currently, and we are constantly recruiting new state chapters so that we can have one in every state. And I would totally welcome a chance back to talk more about our organization, but today I want to focus on the bills that were introduced this last legislative session because they will have a great effect on education in South Carolina. So the bills that I want to talk about is the House Bill 3759 and Senate Bill 419. The bill in the House was the original version, and it originated with Speaker Jay Lucas. He's the one that introduced it, as well as some big name representatives who sponsored it, and it was a huge Republican-led effort, honestly. But the title of the bill is South Carolina Career Opportunity and Access for All Act, and part one is statewide college and career readiness goal. And the preface of the bill says this, in quotes, a vibrant workforce is critical to sustaining and growing the economy of the state by servicing industry and attracting industry. So the focus of education is no longer academic, but it is preparing children for jobs that are determined by politically appointed workforce boards, which I'll get to that in a little while, and mandated by the federal government. Some of you probably know some of this information, but for those of you who may have not heard this before, if you think I'm making anything up, you can fact check me, because I know when I was learning a lot of this, I didn't believe half of it until I went and looked at it myself. This is where I think it gets really interesting. So some of you may be familiar with Mark Tucker. He is the president of the National Center on Education and the Economy. And in 1992, just a year after I was born, he wrote a letter to Hillary Clinton. It's called the Dear Hillary letter, which you may have heard of that before. But I'm just going to read it because straight from the letter it says, it lays out a plan to remold the entire American system into a seamless web that literally extends from cradle to grave, and is the same system for everyone, coordinated by a system of labor market boards at the local, state, and federal levels, where curriculum and job matching will be handled by counselors accessing the integrated computer-based program. Yes. So this is an attempt to control the economy, and you can imagine with the letter being sent to Hillary Clinton that that's exactly what they wanted to do. So children essentially become human resources for the government to service and attract industry, just what's in the bill that was introduced this last January, which is a Marxist term, by the way, human resources. It was coined by Hegel in 1850 when they tried to do the exact same thing. So 2 years after that letter was written to Hillary Clinton, President Bill Clinton becomes elected, or 2 years later after he becomes elected, that letter evolves into 3 education laws: Goals 2000, School to Work, and Improving America's Schools. actually just want to read a little quote from a man named Sam Blumenfeld. You may know him. He's the author of about 50 books on phonics and education. And he says that progressives took it upon themselves in the pursuit of a utopian dream to attempt to change American society from a competitive, dog-eat-dog capitalistic system into a peaceful, serene, non-competitive society where all were equal, economically equal, wearing the same utilitarian clothes, living in uniform public housing, and obeying the laws and regulations of a bureaucracy which put them to work in a planned economy. He's also the co-author of Crimes of the Educators. It's a book that has so much information in it. That was the first book I read, and didn't believe half of it at first. So, the goal of this system and these laws are almost certainly not the same goal that I have for my child going to school. I can tell you that. There was a radical change in education around this time, and elementary and secondary education became reinvented. In the 90s, there was a big push for national standards that was defeated. And then in 2009, with the Race to the Top grant competition initiative, whatever you want to call it, we got Common Core, which is the newest national standard. Well, not new, but. Oh, and my last point is that the standards can only be effective if they're measured by assessments, and this is when standardized tests came about. They're a requirement from the federal government, and we know that there's not a lot of people who like the tests. So I mentioned politically appointed workforce boards a few minutes ago, and this is a picture from a page out of the book called The Long War and Common Core. It was written by the president of the Constitutional Coalition. Her name's Donna Hurd. She worked under Reagan in the Department of Education. And that book is amazing. So I didn't bring any with me, I ran out. But if you can find The Long War and Common Core, I highly suggest getting that book. So, I'm sorry? The Long War and Common Core by Donna Hurd. This is a workforce system chart that was based on the Workforce Investment Act of 1998. So this is law, and these are actually set up. There's local, there's regional, and there's state and federal and regional workforce boards, which I didn't know. I had no idea until I went on our South Carolina Department of Education website and clicked on 8 different links to get to 8 different websites until I found that, yeah, that's right. It is indeed set up this way, and it started back in the 90s. The outstanding feature of this system is how many outsiders have influence on your child and their education, and that it's not just about while they're in school, it's for their lives. This data that they want to track using different boards, and of course now in the digital era, everything can be tracked. So I just wanted to show that it is indeed law, and it's set up this way. Okay, so I actually, in the beginning of my presentation, I was going to say that every time you hear college and career ready, because section 1 of the bill is statewide college and career readiness goal, that it means Common Core. And here's proof. Because in 2015, they rewrote the standards because we adopted Common Core, and there was a lot of pushback, imagine that. So the Department of Education said, yes, we'll rewrite the standards. They rewrote the standards. Then the South Carolina Education Oversight Committee did a cross-analysis between the Common Core state standards and what we have now, which are the South Carolina College and Career Readiness Standards. So this top table is the English Language Arts comparison, and this top number is how much aligned they are, which is 89%. And I know this quite well because my mother-in-law was in this fight. And the reason it's not more aligned is because she and countless other parents fought to have cursive writing put back in the standards because Common Core eliminated that. And down here is the math. The math is 92% aligned, and it was more aligned until they put back in the memorization of math facts instead of the lattice method and all. Well, it's still in there, but how we learn math. You memorize and then you know. That's it. 2 times 2 is 4. Okay, and so now on our advisory board is Professor Sandra Stotsky, and she sat on the Common Core state standards, which they weren't state-led either. But she sat on the validation committee, and she refused to sign off on the standards because how developmentally inappropriate they were. They're not rigorous. They were not developed by a group of experts, nor are they internationally benchmarked or comparable to those in other leading nations. She says she has no idea who wrote the standards, but that they're insane. I've listened to a lot of her. I've met her a couple times, but she's Sandra Stotsky is her name, and she's an expert on Common Core. And she is completely opposed to its developmentally inappropriateness. So another reason that this slide's so important is because about 5 or 6 years ago, when we were about 5 or 6 years into Common Core, about 4 or 5 years, parents really began to realize, and not just parents, teachers began to realize the problems with Common Core. So let's just, for example, and I've heard this several times, Johnny comes home with his new Common Core math homework and says, "Dad, can you please help me?" You know, his dad's an accountant. "Please help me with this math homework." His dad takes a look at it and says, "I've never seen this before, I can't help you." Dad can't help a 4th grader with his 4th grade math homework? Stupid dad. I mean, so it really forms a wedge between the parent and the child. I mean, I've heard it from across the country that this is what's happening. And lastly, before we move on from the standards, in South Carolina, they're called the South Carolina College and Career Readiness Standards. In Florida, they're called the Florida Sunshine Standards. In Texas, they're called the Texas College and Career Readiness Standards. Indiana is the Indiana Standards. So they've rebranded in every state. They've rebranded them. There's not a state in the United States of America that does not have Common Core standards. So back to the bill itself. In the House bill, there was a committee in that bill that was supposed to be established, politically appointed committee called the 0 to 20 Committee, which in its name alone is alarming. The cradle to the grave is from the Dear Hillary letter. So in this modern computer day era, digital data and data in general is gold, and it's traded, it's worth a lot of money, especially student data. And they say that they protect it with FERPA, but under the Obama administration, FERPA was gutted. So your child's identifiable information can be shared with anyone who says it's for education research or for the efficacy of that education program because of what happened to FERPA. So this originated in the House. The committee is charged with, these are the functions of the committee in the bill. They're charged with collecting data from birth or 0, which I'm not really sure, I still am not sure what all data that is, and to after high school 20. So Representative Shannon Erickson from Beaufort County, when they were debating this bill on the House floor for 6.5 hours, she said that it was the legislators' responsibility to measure and track all children in South Carolina, if they're in private or if they're homeschooled or anything, because they don't have data on the 0 to 5 age range. I mean, she says that along with other representatives in the debate. So this committee was actually struck from the Senate bill, thank goodness, but all of the functions are shifted underneath the Department of Education. So there's not a whole another politically appointed committee that's going to be doing all this data collection. It'll just be underneath the State Department of Education. And the original name of the director of this committee was called the Education Czar, but they quickly changed that because imagine why.
Yeah.
Representative Rita Allison said in the debate as well that she wanted to merge all data silos. And so I created this little graph to show what kinds of data they would be merging. So that First Steps, Head Start, K-12, college data, tech school data, DHEC, DSS, DMV, any government agency that they can get data from, they will. If they merge the data silos. And there's another bill, I forget the number of it, but it's called the Data Warehouse Bill. So if you mix those two bills together, it's a disaster. So they can see, if Johnny wants this job, let's look back and see what Johnny was doing when he was 12. Did he get suspended from school when he was 14? What kind of effect will that have on his future job opportunities? So it's really problematic, especially me having a young child. Not good. So just listen to her words, and I don't have much time left.
One of the things that the bill does is coordinate efforts to know where our 0 to 5 population actually is. Right now, we have such a hodgepodge of a system. Some children in public, some in private, some in a combination of the two, some with First Steps, some with faith-based, some in-home. They all have different degrees of accountability, and really, truly no one group is following where these children are. A plan for our children to look at their lives and look at the state of South Carolina and look at our job force and look at the companies that we're going to bring and take a holistic approach to what we're going to offer them in their career moves. It's very important that we look at the holistic child from 0 up. Am I standing here as a proponent for taking infants into public schools? No. I'm telling you that our families deserve our support in all of those different groups, no matter where they choose to educate their children, but that we have a responsibility to know where they are, to account for them, and to know where they're going and how they're doing so that we can measure the progress. If we do not measure it, it will not get done.
So I've had people tell me that it was taken out of context. It wasn't. So the fiscal impact of this bill is about $93 million right now, and actually Representative Jonathan Hill from Anderson County said that the Anderson County School District told him that their minor cost-benefit analysis they did showed, what was it, $2 million in unfunded mandates. This is actually something that Jonathan Hill did, and put this up on the screen, and I emailed him and asked if I could have it. So it's a lot of money on local school districts that they're not going to get the money for. So it's just, it's a lot of money that's going to be wasted, and no academic achievement, I believe, will happen. There's added testing, competency-based education. I wish I had more time. They'll do everything on the computer. That's part of this. All of their tests on the computer, all of their learning. And it's not like homeschool, where you have a computer and the technology is useful, because I absolutely believe in technology and computers with education, especially nowadays. I mean, information's everywhere. But when you have a child sit down at a computer and the teacher is reduced to a facilitator and they're prompted with a question, and the answer to their question changes the next question that they're given, it's not good in my opinion. I don't have much time left. Senator Greg Hembry, we did meet with him, and he told us, I just wanted to throw this out there, he told us that he's never heard a constituent say that we should elect the State Board of Education, and this was one of the points I was getting to. Because right now, our State Board of Education, in correspondence to the state constitution, is politically appointed. So if anybody here is represented by Senator Greg Hembry, give him a call and say, hey, we want to elect our State Board of Education. This is an amendment that Representative Josiah Hill was able to pass in the House version. This is one that my mother-in-law and some of the leaders in USPIE came up with. It's a cost analysis of how much money we get from the federal government for education and how much we actually spend complying with all of their regulations and unfunded mandates. And then lastly, we want to propose a Senate amendment, and I have handouts up here that have all these talking points and everything that we support, which is repealing Common Core. We would write new standards using the pre-Common Core Massachusetts standards, which were number one in the world for ELA because Sandra Stotsky helped write those. And then we would use the Iowa Test of Basic Skills, which has been around since 1925. Hundreds of homeschoolers use this test. It's not adaptive, it's not new, it's not for 21st century, which I don't really understand how everything is changing. I mean, I get technology, but it's like, 2000 came around and everything's got to be reinvented. Everything's got to be different, which I just don't think that's true at all. And then steps that the legislature can take, these are also up here. To wean itself from the federal funds, which is not a lot, but they control a lot of what happens in the classroom. Foster accountability by eliminating the Education Oversight Committee and allowing us to elect our State Board of Education. And then to achieve educational excellence, we need to abandon this whole workforce development model and return to a classical education, proven model of education. Ways you can help, pick up some stuff here, sign in on my sheet, and I'll put you on the email list. And that's my daughter. I just